So welcome to each of you who are here, and it should be a wonderful program. We're looking forward to it, and it's nice to see some familiar names popping up on the screen. So we don't get to see you in person these days, but Dennis is going to talk about the prospect of a hybrid in-person and Zoom meeting combined starting next month. But I'll let him discuss that. We were chatting a bit about birds. This is a great time of year to be out birding and looking for the spring migrants as they arrive. I did have a brief announcement. We are planning to have Swift events at Agate Hall Chimney in April. That's kind of the classic month when they start to show up in some numbers that are worth looking for. And so we have two events for Agate Hall Chimney scheduled on the calendar. One is Friday night, April 15th, and the other one is Friday, April 29th. The weekend, the Friday in between that has a big track meet scheduled at Hayward Field, so it's better if we don't try to be at the Swift event on those nights. So if that's something you've never been to, you might want to come out and help us enjoy watching the box of Swifts go in that chimney this coming month. So that's really the only announcement I have, and I think Debbie might have something to share with you as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on our quail article about Lake Ebert and the saline lakes, and to say there is some good news. There has been approval of federal funding to monitor and assess the situation with the Great Salt Lake Basin, and including here in Oregon. So we're hopeful that we'll learn a lot and figure out ways to help all of the birds that use those saline lakes as migratory stopovers. And speaking of migration, I just wanted to remind everybody that it is coming. Birds have started to migrate in, and soon they'll be flying over our skies at night in great numbers. Even birds that are usually active in the day tend to migrate at night, and that means we can be mindful of how we can help the birds. And the best thing we could do is not attract them down with artificial lighting. So if you have any floodlights, please remove them. Use security lighting that points down and is shielded up, and close your windows, your blinds and your shades, so light's not pouring out and disorienting the birds. And then we can enjoy watching them pass on their way or arrive here from their winter grounds. And I will turn it over to Dennis. Thanks, everyone.
Well, hi, everyone. I want to tell you a little bit about next month before I introduce tonight's speaker. On April 26th, we're going to have Bruce Newhouse presenting a program about our local pollinators. Bruce is a native of the Willamette Valley, grew up in Lake Oswego in that area. He's my expert on bugs and spiders and mushrooms and plants and birds too. Whenever I find some weird looking spider web or a funny looking mushroom, I always take a picture and send it to him and find out what it is. So he's really one of those guys who knows about a whole lot of different things. So we're going to have him talk about pollinators. Did you ever wonder about those flying and crawling critters that are visiting your flowers? Do you know how to tell a bee from a fly? Do you know that hummingbirds and some flies are good pollinators? Do you know how to plant a garden that will be the best possible place for native pollinators? If these kinds of questions go through your mind as you stare at your garden, this is a great presentation for you. We will familiarize ourselves with the most common native pollinators, learn about a few simple tricks to tell them apart. We'll also learn some of the best things we can do to invite these native pollinators into our yards. So Bruce's program will be one of our first hybrid programs in a while. It'll be at 100 Willamette Hall at the University of Oregon. His program will also be available over Zoom for anyone who wishes to participate from home. And we will also record the program so you can view it later if you want. And this will be our normal procedure for future Audubon meetings. In other words, some in part in person, hybrid in the sense that you will also be Zoom, and we'll also do the recording. And May's program will also be on campus. And then in the fall, we've made arrangements with the Campbell Center in Eugene. That's that place out near the river by Skinner Butte Park. And they have a wonderful facility with good equipment, overhead projector, big screen, portable microphones, and we'll also be able to Zoom programs out of there to you if you want to participate from home. So we'll have, so actually tonight may be the last of our Zoom only meetings. Of course, the fingers crossed, you know, and all of that. So for tonight we have Magnus Persmark, who's going to tell us about a trip he did into southern Ecuador in January of this year. Magnus grew up in Gothenburg, Sweden. He got his first binoculars when he was 10 years old, a gift from his grandfather. Nice grandfather. I'm a good grandfather too. He came to the United States in the 80s and ended up staying here and has been living in Eugene since 2005. He's a member of our Wednesday bird group. We see him quite a bit with his wife, Rosie Hammond. And on this trip, Rosie accompanied him, as well as Randy Sinnott and some other people, but those are the ones that are part of the Wednesday group. So we're real excited to have him and have this program about a part of Ecuador that I have traveled to with my friends Kit and Jim Regali and Roger. And I know the birds of this area. I know the places we're going to see tonight. I'm so excited about this. So I'm not going to tell you all the wonderful things you're going to see. You'll just have to wait. And Magnus, let's let you take it over and take us to southern Ecuador.
All right, Dennis, thank you much for the kind introduction. And given that you have been to this area, I will have you answer any questions that might come up. Thank you also to everyone on the screen for tuning in. It's a privilege to talk to you. And let's get to it. This is the itinerary, or sorry, it's the agenda. It's pretty basic. It's going to talk mostly about birds, but before we get to the birds, I want to give you a little bit of context. So why Ecuador and why now? Well, like most everyone else, I think the opportunity to travel internationally was very appealing after 2 years of COVID lockdown. And Ecuador specifically, it's a small country, has good infrastructure, and certainly during the time of COVID and Omicron, that the country had high vaccination rates, frankly higher than that of the US, as well as stringent safety protocols, was reassuring. Most importantly, certainly for us as natural history students, is the biodiversity of the country. And so to refer to the COVID situation again, immediately on arriving in Guayaquil Airport, we were met with placards encouraging us to maintain a safe distance, in this case 6.5 feet rather, which corresponds to 2 meters. And we also came across this drive-in lab in downtown Guayaquil for testing. I think all this reassured us. Once we were out in the bush, so to speak, all of these concerns faded away rather immediately. But also in Guayaquil, traveling in on the tramway from an island, this placard, I think, pretty clearly and colorfully demonstrated how seriously the country took COVID safety regimens, and the credit placed to the health professionals in the country. So to Ecuador itself, it's of course located in rather on the equator, but it has some interesting similarities to Oregon, in fact. Both sit on the Pacific coast. Both are about the same size, roughly 100,000 square miles. Both have a slope going up to a mountain crest, which in Ecuador, of course, is the Andes, and then going down to a more flat area, which in Oregon is dry, high desert. In Ecuador is very humid Amazon rainforest. So this all contributes to the presence of about 10 distinct biogeographic regions in the country, and they in turn help provide the different habitats that support about 1,650 species of birds. It's just pretty remarkable given the size of the country. 42 of those are country endemics, albeit a fair number of those in the Galapagos, although there are some endemic species in the continental country itself. Just as a frame of reference, in Oregon, we have about 275 regularly breeding birds, with just short of 100 moving through regularly on migration. So it's about, well, it's several fold higher. And South America itself is known as the bird continent. It has almost 3,500 different bird species, more than any other continent. And of those, 2,500 are endemic. It's quite remarkable. And I chose here to illustrate this diversity by taking some distribution maps from Merlin, which is the Cornell-based app that I think Vera spoke about last month together with eBird. And so if we start with a palm tanager on the left, it's distributed through much of tropical South America into Central America, whereas the blue-winged mountain tanager has a much more non-contiguous or fragmented distribution on both sides, in cloud forests on both sides of the Andes. And this fragmentation or non-contiguous distribution also suggests how South America became so species rich in the first place. So through the Andean uprise, it was created a number of different habitats, and after the formation of the Amazon and Grand Orinoco rivers, that also created both new environments as well as barriers for birds. And finally, during the Pleistocene, there have been a number of climatic changes, such as periods of dry weather or dry climate, when parts of the Amazon was fragmented into patches of rainforest surrounded by drier grasslands, similarly in the mountain forests. And I think that that is, as a result of that, we're seeing this fragmented distribution of the mountain tanager. And it also suggests how new species are being created and are being recognized. In fact, frankly, in Ecuador, in the last 30 odd years, we've had about 5 entirely new species discovered, a few of them through splits, but a few of them also new to science entirely. Finally, the orange-throated tanager illustrates how some species have a really, really small range. And again, this might be explained by a bird that has a limited capacity to distribute because it has very specific habitat or food requirements. And that is also one of the factors that contribute to speciation on the whole. So with that as context, let's jump to the birds. And here we have a small black bird. And I'm saying this rather facetiously, but not entirely, because when someone from North America for the first time travels to the neotropics, it can be absolutely frustratingly challenging. Not only are there a lot of birds, they are unfamiliar. The neotropics have 28 endemic bird families. And that means for a novice like me, when I went to this region the first time, that you have no idea of what you're looking at. You don't know what to reference. You don't know whether it's here we know it's a warbler. We have a clear reference frame, so it's easy to hone in looking in the field guide. So suffice is to say that it's challenging, and having a guide along is certainly very helpful. This is an ant bird, and I will talk a little bit more about ant birds and other tropical species as we get into the presentation. Now, as I said, we had a guide. We had a very good guide. In fact, his name was Jose Illanes. He's Ecuadorian. He was born in the Amazon in the Napo region. His uncle was one of the first native bird guides in Ecuador, and Jose was just fantastic. He was so dedicated, in fact, that he would don camouflage to go into the bush. Joking here, of course, but he could identify every bird by sight, obviously, but also essentially every minor chip note, and that was essential when birding, for example, in rainforests like this. Beautiful forest habitat, and we were also fortunate to stay in some very nice lodges. And to those lodges, I think I spent just a minute or two on the Jocotoco Foundation. So it's an NGO in Ecuador that is focused on preserving habitat critical to birds, and it was set up just after the discovery of the Jocotoco Antpitta that Dennis referred to in his introduction. And they not only have a number of preserves throughout Ecuador. On some of these preserves, those dots are red. They also have lodges, and we actually spent time in or visited all of these 7 in southern Ecuador, so very highly recommended. And here's our tour map, starting in Guayaquil, going south along the coast, heading up into the mountains, crossing the Andes down into the eastern foothills, ending at Yanquam, heading back up in the mountains through some dry intermountainous valleys, back to Guayaquil, and then finally over to the coast again and some new habitat. What I'm going to do in the presentation is not take you through this sequentially, but rather take you from the west coast going east, ending up in the foothills of the Amazon. So this was labeled by Tropical Birding as a medium to intense tour. So it meant that we were in the field, out in the field from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. pretty much every day. It meant that not all the habitats we visited were pristine. Here we are looking for some birds at a rubbish dump, for instance. It also meant that not all meals were taken in a restaurant. Some were taken by the side of the road. And notice how careful we are to adhere to the distance protocols. And similarly, some of the birding was not on trails, but again, on the side of the road. So this was very high intensity. They call it medium to high. I don't know what the medium refers to. Maybe it's the fact that we were, in fact, given time for breakfast and a shower now and then. But this was for 3 weeks straight on. This was pretty intense. So we're starting here now on the coast. It has a range of habitats: mangrove, salt pans, shrub, and lowland forest. It also has a large number of banana plantation, rice plantations, and so on. it's heavily cultivated, and that's one of the problems in this region. But we did visit areas that are relatively non-disturbed. Here we have Dave Westervelt and Randy Sinnott braving coastal shrub. This is dry, very dry forest or shrub area. Whereas we go a little bit further east inland and we come to more humid, semi-deciduous forest. And it was interesting with this tree here that you may see have scars in its bark. The local park ranger told us that this was used when a child is delivered who with umbilical cord problems. The parent or relative would go out to this tree, chop a bit of bark, take it home, make a poultice, and apply it to the umbilical cord or the navel region, and supposedly it would cure the affliction. And they would also bury $1 by the foot of the tree. We were sorely tempted to dig in the ground, but abstained from doing so. So we also birded on the beach. Beautiful, pristine beaches with not very much tourism today. What we saw here, some of these birds are at least superficially familiar to the North American birder. The kelp gull resembles a bit a western gull or certainly a great black-backed gull. In flight, they have much less white in the primaries, essentially just a few mirrors. And it has been seen in North America a couple of times, certainly a bird worth looking out for. The gray-hooded gull is more tropical. But just strikingly beautiful with its red legs and sharp eye. Unfortunately, we also came across some scenes that were less uplifting. Ecuador has 4 species of sea turtles, green leatherback, olive ridge fleece, and also the hawksbill, which is critically endangered. And what we learned from the park ranger is that fishermen, when they catch sea turtles, have a tendency to hit them with some sharp object. And we saw several corpses on the beach, unfortunately. So there are a couple of preserves, but it's sad to see this type of wanton destruction going on. Another really unusual bird we came across out in this dry shrubland area is the Peruvian thickney. It ranges from Ecuador down to Chile, just in a narrow region along the coast. And they are night active, which one might surmise from the large eyes. And in the day, they just hang out, so to speak, and are difficult to see because they really blend in very well. They are shorebirds, but they don't really look like most of the shorebirds we're used to seeing here. In fact, they move a bit like miniature ostriches. We came across a number of flycatchers, like this gray and white tarantula that Randy captured. We'll talk a bit more about flycatchers as we move on, but certainly the gray and white one is distinctive with this somewhat sinister looking split crest. We called it the devil bird, but nonetheless, it's an attractive member of its genus. Here, we also ran into one of the birds that represents a family not found in North America. This is a necklaced spinetail, and it's part of the ovenbird or family. In large and diverse family, about 300 species or so from Mexico to South America. But again, there's no reference frame here directly for North American birder. And just as a curious note, they are not at all related to the ovenbird that we find in the southeastern deciduous forest. Of course, our ovenbird is a wood warbler member. One of the most sought after birds in this area of the country is the Pacific royal flycatcher. They are uncommon. They are vulnerable because of habitat destruction. The numbers are not exactly known, but are believed to range between 2,500 and 10,000. So we were very fortunate indeed to see it. And Rosie was even luckier because she saw, if you see here, the flycatcher has a striking crest plume that it raises only on very special occasions, very briefly. And Rosie happened to have the bird in her binoculars when it did so. And finally, the Esmeralda's wood star is also a very special bird of this region. It's only found in Ecuador and in small numbers. In fact, it was thought for a long time to be extinct, but was rediscovered in the late 90s. There are only about 1,000 or 2,000 left of them in the world. Unfortunately, a couple of preserves have been set aside to ensure that its consistence is guaranteed. It's only 2.5 inches long or so, so one of the smaller hummingbird species in the world, a bit like our calliope, perhaps. We not only saw birds, but also other creatures like this northern ghost bat. And I was interested to learn that this is not a albino individual. The ghost bats, but 5 species or so that are completely white or grayish white. They are insect eaters, ranging throughout South America, some in Central America and Trinidad, but just a beautiful, beautiful little bat species that allowed us to photograph him up close. So from the immediate coast, we are moving into the wetter coastal forest. And where we went specifically was the Umbrella Bird Reserve and the Buenaventura Lodge. They had hummingbird and fruit feeders, which made it very easy to get good looks and decent photographs of some of these really strikingly colorful tropical birds, the honey creeper and the thick-billed euphonia as 2 examples. And of course, there are also hummingbirds. And I'm going to show you a number of hummingbirds throughout the presentation, not only because Ecuador has a large number of them, 122 species, but also because they are so striking and relatively speaking, easy to photograph. The violet-tailed sylph in the middle was photographed by Randy Sinnott again, and just that tail streamer is just magnificent. Not all hummingbirds are colorful, iridescent. The brown violet here is large, is rather aggressive, and has very plain plumage, except these iridescent throat and ear feathers, but still very, very beautiful bird. And this violet or violet purple coronet was, I think, really interesting in that it did not hover. It's a large hummingbird, and it seeks nectar from these flowers with very narrow openings, and perhaps for that reason it actually grabs on. I haven't turned this. This is how the bird fed, and it grabbed onto the flowers and proceeded from there to stick its bill into these narrow, long tubular flowers and seek nectar. Just fascinating. And beyond the hummingbirds, of course, there are many other tropical birds that are just colorful and have details in their plumage that are just striking when you look at them close up. The eye and the orbital ring here of the masked parakeet, the serrated bill of the aracari, and the feather texture of the honey creeper. It's just one marvels at the diversity of nature. Certainly not all neotropical birds are colorful. I don't think anyone, even by the largest stretch of the imagination, could call the white-throated screech owl somewhat related to our western screech owl or the black-crowned antshrike for colorful, but we were more than happy to encounter them in the forest. And I think these photos also illustrate one of the challenges with birding in the neotropics. In these dense forests, it can be very difficult to see birds, much less photograph them. So I apologize if some of these photos have partly obscured bird or busy backgrounds. It's just how they live. Now, the key drive or the key reason for us to visit the Tapichalaka Reserve, also in this habitat, was to see Antpittas and the Jocotoco Antpitta in particular. As I mentioned, it was discovered in '97 by Robert Ridgely, discovered new to science. It was completely unknown to science. And it has a very limited range and a small population, so that the preserve was set up specifically, and the Jocotoco Foundation specifically, to help preserve these species. And Antpittas are famously secretive and difficult to observe and study. They've sort of been the bane of neotropical bird researchers for years. On par with our rails or with tinamous or tapacudos, just very skulking, very, very difficult to get close to. And there's a wonderful, heartwarming story about how all that changed in the early 2000s by the discoveries of an Ecuadorian farmer named Angel Paz in northern Ecuador. I think that story is maybe a little bit too long for this, but suffices to say that Angel figured out that one can customize these birds by feeding them mealworms, and that practice has spread to other lodges, including Tapichalaka. So the local guide would, in the morning, feed these Antpittas mealworms, and they would come in. He would call for them to come. It was just spectacular to witness. And in the same area, we also came across this chestnut named Antpitta as well. There, of course, aren't only birds that draw one's attention by their colors and shapes. I think the diversity of insects and ants are exemplified here by these photos of moths and caterpillars and creatures that I don't even know what they are, beyond that they're just fascinating. And so that is something that kept us up at night. Now, something else that we encountered that I think was fascinating was this mass of social caterpillars. We actually first, from a distance, thought this was a slug, but it's, as you see, a group of caterpillars, social caterpillars, that are moving in unison. And interestingly, they move faster as a cohort than they could as individuals, because the whole thing is moving. And they probably do this for reasons of either improved foraging or defense, or in some cases for thermal regulation. But it's, again, one of those truly fascinating aspects of nature that draws us back time and time again. Now, from this wetter mountain forest, we drove up into the dry Tambesian forest. It's a particular and unusual habitat in south central Ecuador, and the Horupi Reserve has been set up specifically to preserve plants, in this case more than birds. I think there are a number of plant and tree species that are endemic to this small region, including the ceiba or kapok tree in this picture has green bark that is actually has photosynthetic capabilities, just fascinating. It also had birds, including flycatchers. Flycatchers is the largest bird family in South America, and I think the largest bird family in the world with more than 400 species. They're also quite diverse. Some are relatively nondescript, like the Peruvian tyrannulate, and certainly this smoke-colored peewee, which is a relative of our western peewee that we also saw. And I think, as many know, flycatchers like the Amphidonax flycatchers can be devilishly difficult to identify. And when, as in Ecuador, there are over 200 species, it is a task not for the weak of heart. Fortunately, we had a guide who was expert in identifying them, and that helped us quite a bit. And beyond, we actually saw western wood peewees in Ecuador. And while there are much fewer neotropical migrants than, say, in Central America, we also came across Swainson's thrush, Acadian flycatcher, barn swallows, Blackburnian and Canada warblers, and summer tanagers, one cerulean warbler. I said that the flycatchers are a diverse family. That is exemplified, I think, magnificently by this black-crested tit tyrant. This was the punk bird of our trip. Just a beautiful, beautiful little flycatcher. The streaked-backed wren in this photo is an example of a family that originated in South America together with hummingbirds, for instance, and have spread into North America, and in the case of the wrens, also into Eurasia. The streakback was one of the more common wrens we encountered, and it's relatively large, reminding us a bit about cactus wren in North America. And the streakback, as well as some other South American birds, have apparently developed large bills in order to prey on large insects. And there's no doubt that this wren had captured the large moth, and it expended good amount of energy bashing the daylights out of the moth before it proceeded to ingest it. Now, we saw a fair number of raptors, including this graybacked hawk, which we were lucky indeed to see. This is a rare raptor. The population is between 250 and 1,000 birds. And it's threatened by deforestation, and its habitat has become fragmented, further challenging its survival. And what you can see here is that the bird is in extraordinarily heavy mold. It has a couple of new primary feathers come out here, but these primaries and the secondaries here are terribly, terribly worn. The tail, in fact, is entirely gone. It's unclear whether this is due to wear and tear from normal life in the forest, or if it's also due to some kind of mites or other disease. But whatever the case may be, we were very lucky and fortunate to see it. Now, I think we were also not lucky, but it was just remarkable that we found this bird, the common paraki. It's a relative of nighthawks we can see in Oregon. I don't know if you can see the eye here and the body and the tail. Dave Westerfeld spotted this bird literally on the trail as we were walking. And it turns out it was incubating a single egg laid directly on the ground. Now, the rufous-headed chachalaca is also relatively inconspicuously plumaged, but it could not stay hidden even if it tried to. At least it could stay out of sight, but certainly not out of identification range. It is, like most members of its genus, very noisy. It serenaded us from morning till very late at night. The white-tailed jay is also rather noisy and a very pretty member of its family that is represented here by, for instance, the California scrub jay and the Steller's jay. Now, I don't know if it's a coincidence. I presume it's a coincidence, but two of the birds that frequented this area, the golden grosbeak and the yellow-tailed oriole, look superficially almost identical: yellow, black, and white wing parts. Presumably it is a coincidence, but it's curious and they're strikingly pretty. More to the birds that are associated normally with the neotropics is this whooping motmot, and of course most people who have visited the neotropics know their sort of barking calls that range far and wide, and they are also, several of the species in this family have these racket-tailed feathers in it. They feed on insects and even large lizards, as the large bill might suggest. Now, the trogon, Ecuadorian trogon we see in this picture is another representative of really an iconic tropical birds. There are some 24 species in the neotropics. We saw several in Ecuador. They are very colorful and they're pretty conspicuous. They feed on them. They're fruit eaters, so relatively easy to observe. Something else that I learned in preparing for this talk is that trogons are also the only member of bird family that has a so-called heterodactyl toe arrangement. That means there are two toes pointing forward and there are two toes pointing back. So there. And when it comes to colorfulness, I think it's hard to beat this rainbow star frontlet. Just the extraordinary iridescence of all the rainbow's colors in its head and throat feathers. And with that sparkling image, we will leave this forest and move farther up into the mountains. And the forest environment here was really quite fantastic. We came across a number of orchids, myriad of bromeliads, and so beyond the birds themselves, the environment we were in was just spectacular. We stayed at the Copalinga Lodge and Reserve that is familiar to several members of the Lane Audubon. And beyond orchids and bromeliads, we also came across a number of butterflies. The leftmost one is a clearwing. It's apparently a rusty clearwing, and they are called clearwings for obvious reasons, and again, strikingly pretty. But we came for birds, and we saw birds. The masked flower piercer is a curious creature. They're called flower parasites. There are several species of them. They all have little hooks at the top of their bills that they use to pierce the base of flowers to get at the nectar. So they don't contribute to pollination. They are simply out for the sweet nectar. So I think the name flower parasite is justified in this case. We also ran into some other flycatchers. Here we have one, the cinnamon, that is certainly very, very attractive brownish cinnamon. And of course, there are also hummingbirds. The chestnut-breasted coronet is large, is aggressive, and just brilliantly plumaged. But hummingbirds, as you've seen and know, don't have to be large to be striking. We have here a spangled coquette. It is very small and it's very spunky. And it was quite adept at holding its own against larger competitors at the flowers. And of course, we also head into the forest for other birds. The puffbirds all have pretty cryptic plumage. They typically sit quiet for long periods of time before selling out to catch a prey. And we're lucky to find this black-streaked puffbird. And something I'd like to point out here is one of the other challenges of photographing in this type of forest is that it's really dark. Even in the middle of the day, you can see that the picture is a bit grainy. And of course, one has a couple of options to use in photographing birds: ISO, shutter speed, and an f-stop. And even when all those are optimized in this darkness, one has to put the speed at 6400 or even 12,000 ISO, and at least with today's sensors, that means that the images are a bit grainy. The picture, this fantastic picture by Randy of the Amazonian umbrella bird, is not grainy. He caught it up in the canopy, a fortunate view, and the umbrella bird, both the long wattle that we saw at Buenaventura, but were not fortunate enough to photograph, as well as the Amazonian umbrella bird, had this really bizarre wattle that hangs down from its throat. They're jet black, they're large, and they're just conspicuous. Fantastic to see. The pale-headed brush finch, and I apologize here for the poor quality of the photo, was difficult not only to photograph because of its habitat and secretive nature. It is also exceedingly rare. It has a very, very restricted range, and there only exists about 200 individuals in the world. It is threatened not only by lack of suitable habitat. There are a lot of plantations nearby that appear to have taken up much of the remaining habitat, but it is also threatened by cowbird parasitism. Fortunately, intense efforts were put in place about 20 years ago or so to stabilize the population decline. Unfortunately, that has succeeded. So hopefully with continued and increasing conservation efforts, the population will stabilize and perhaps even increase. We saw additional antpittas. Typically, we would see them as the slate crown on the right. This was the best view we had after spending about 2 hours standing by the end of the road, edge of the road. And literally this bird is 15 feet from us. It would just, this was the best we could see. And that is again, typical for antpittas. The equatorial or rufous was more accommodating at a launch. So from the antpittas here, we are moving higher yet into the Andean shrub and the Paramo region. And Paramo is an ecosystem above the tree line, the contiguous tree line in the Andes. And the vegetation is, I think, really marvelously varied. Consists mostly of shrubs and grasses and forbs of different kinds and giant rosettes. Again, the textures and colors and shapes were just magnificent. But we came for the birds and we saw some. This chestnut-winged Synclodes is one of about a dozen species in its genus throughout South America, the Andean region. They're terrestrial, most commonly found in grasslands, and in some cases also at the beach, in fact. And I thought this was an interesting set of photos. We see the bird finding a prey in the grass and then lunging for it, and notice how it closes its eye cleverly so it won't get stuck by the grass stalks. Other high Andean birds included this Andean guan, and guans are members of a family of pretty large chicken-like birds. And I say chicken-like not only because they look a bit like chickens, but also because they are or have been extensively hunted. Many of them are therefore in decline and heavily reliant on the presence of preserves to help stabilize the population. Now, yet another type of habitat in the high Andes is the Polylepis forest. And Polylepis is a genus that has about 30 shrub or tree species in the neotropics. They are endemic to this region of the Andes. Most of them are, as these ones here, gnarled in shape and have this bark that flakes. And in fact, the name derives from the many, from poly in Greek, and lettuce, which means layers. More importantly, for birds that are number birds that are either loosely or very strongly associated with these forests. So critical to preserving the birds is also preserving this forest habitat, which has been a challenge because of deforestation. There are about 14 species of birds that are almost completely dependent on Polylepis forests. Including them are these two tanagers, the buff-breasted and lachrymose mountain tanagers. Randy captured the buff-breasted one. And of course, the lachrymose has its name from the yellow dot here behind the eye, lacrimosa, is tear duct. Another member of the Tanager family is the tit-like Dacnus, also almost exclusively found in Polylepis forest, and this photo also was taken by Randy. The most iconic bird of the Polylepis forest is undoubtedly the giant conebill. It is uncommon, and it is just like some of our crossbill species, just migrating through where the habitat or food sources are plentiful, and so very difficult to stake out or know where to go. It's just a striking bird. Looks a little bit like a red-breasted nuthatch, but it is a completely different creature. And finally, we're going to yet another kind of habitat, and this is that of open paramo with sparse flower coverage. We have a gentian, it's called globito, or little bulb, or balloon in Spanish, and also the chuquiraga, which is an evergreen shrub that is again found in the Andes. And the chuquiraga plant has flowers that is adapted specifically for pollination by hummingbird. And in that, it has a really, really critical role for a number of hummingbird species. And I'm going to show you a couple of them here. The Neblina metaltail is one of the 102 odd species of hummingbirds in Ecuador, and how these small birds can survive in the harsh conditions at over 12,000 feet sparse habitat is just absolutely remarkable. And again, not all are strikingly colored. The blue-mantled thornbill is certainly more discreet. But what I thought was really interesting with this bird is to see it perch on the ground and seek nectar from the globito. Undoubtedly, the most rare and perhaps striking hummingbird of the southern Ecuadorian Andes is the blue-throated Hillstar. It was discovered as recently as 2017, and it is known only from this mountain called Cerro de Arcos, and is entirely reliant on the Chicuraca. So this is what we see here is basically its home range. And while it's encouraging that this area is protected, it was still disturbing to drive through pretty expansive tree plantations leading up. So again, habitat is a critical factor in ensuring the continued survival of many birds in this part of the world. So we're on the home stretch now. We're heading down into the eastern foothills. This is close to, of course, to the Amazonian rainforest, and we had our fair amount of rain down here. This is approaching the most biodiverse region in South America and bird-wise in the world. And unfortunately, again, not all of this is pristine. We're heading up here to the Maico Reserve along the Nangaritza River. And as you might see here, we have a couple of large trucks. These are industrial scale gold mining operations, apparently conducted illegally, but extensively for miles along the river. It was pretty sad to see. But nonetheless, there's still unspoiled wilderness in this area, and beyond the birds again, fantastic flowers, butterflies. We saw a number of heliconias and morphos, and in the lower right, the millipede here that was again just remarkable color and shape. Of course, they're birds, and these two represent species that we normally associate more with the true Amazon basin, the Watson and the purplish jacamar. The Watson in particular is interesting. It is a monotypic species, means it's the only one in its family, and it's about as reptilian as it gets. In fact, the young birds have claws on their wing digits. So if they fall out of the nest close to the water, they can actually clamber back up into the nest. And they're also interesting in the sense that they have a unusual digestive system. It's apparently an enlarged crop in which their vegetarian diet is fermented. And that has given the Watson the less than flattering alternative name of skunk bird or stink bird. We were perhaps thankfully far enough distant not to verify this directly. We were also fortunate to see the orange-breasted tanager, which is one of the reasons the my Cood Reserve was put up. I showed in the introductory slides of bird ranges that the orange-breasted has a very, very small range in far southwestern southeastern Ecuador and northeastern Peru. None of us were fortunate enough to get a picture of it, so I took this from eBird, and the photographer is Lars Peterson. So this is where the tour ended, at least geographically. And given that so many of the birds hang on so tenuously, one is reminded how fragile nature is. And I thought that this bird or this yellow, the mangrove yellow warbler in a way illustrates a futile fight about an imaginary enemy. But I think at the end of the day, we have to consider that humans can prevent further disruption of nature, further prevent disappearances of species, either through support of organizations internationally or locally. We have some terrific environmental organizations in Eugene, and help ensure that the habitats survive that allow these species to thrive. And before I finish, I'd just like to mention a couple of books that I have found informative and learning about tropical environment in general and tropical birds in particular, going from the rather more scientific with Tropical Nature by Forsyth and Miata, over to the very general, The Cloud Forest by Peter Matheson. It has a few decades on it, but Peter Matheson is such a fantastic, engaging storyteller and observer that I can recommend it. But of these, I think especially for people interested in birds, Steve Hilty's Birds of Tropical America is both very well written and well informed and researched. It's highly recommended. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to take questions now if we have time, or out in the field otherwise.
Yes, we have time, of course. And I want to just say those photographs were fantastic. Your narrative was very engaging and very interesting. You did a wonderful job, Magnus.
Oh, thank you.
I really appreciate it. I'm sure that there are people out there that'll have some questions. So hopefully we'll see. Sometimes they do it through the chat system and sometimes they get on here. I'm not sure, Debbie, which way is best.
If anybody wants to speak up, go for it, or feel free to type your question into the chat and we'll get that out to Magnus.
And I will promptly pass them on to you, Dennis.
Oh no, you got them.
What?
And while we're waiting for the questions, I suspect one of the questions is, did we see a lot of birds? Yes, we did see a lot of birds. I think I counted, and my criteria are relatively stringent. I wanted to see the bird well enough to be able to at least know what I saw, even if I couldn't identify it. I landed at 622. I think the entire group with birds either heard that I didn't count or seen by others, we were probably at just over 660, which is just amazing for 3 weeks.
No kidding.
I saw there was one question about the lodges that you stayed at. I know there are several, but maybe you could mention a couple of the ones, your favorites.
I think Copalinga was one of my favorites. Tapichalaka, that was called Casa Simpson, is where we could see the Jocotoco Antpitta. Also highly recommended. But I'd be happy to, and also the Uruaca Lodge, where we saw the umbrella bird, I think was also very nice. All these that are run by the Jocotoco Foundation, they are, they're not luxurious by any stretch of the imagination, but the staff was incredibly helpful, and it's just a privilege to be out in such spectacular environment. So if one would look for the Jocotoco website, they have good information on these lodges and the birds, and so that's probably what I would recommend.
Somebody asked if you smelled any millipedes. I'm not sure if that's, I don't know what that means. Do they smell?
I think some do, and in fact, the large one I saw a photograph of did have some odor, but it wasn't something that would stop us in our tracks out in the field. There are so many other odors and scents in the tropical forest that I think they probably masked that of the caterpillars a bit, or millipedes.
We have a hand up. Feel free to speak up. Is that Dennis?
Yeah, two real quick questions. You were in the bush. Did you have any were you bothered, say, with snakes or definitely mites or so forth? Second question, what was the favored power and make of the binoculars? Thank you. Okay,
good questions. So for the last question first, I prefer to use 8x or 8.5x binoculars in highly forested areas like this. They have a broader field of view, so it's a little bit easier to get birds in sight. They also have a little bit larger depth of field compared to, say, a 10x binocular. I wanted to see snakes, but I was disappointed not to have run into a single one. No, we did not have any ticks. We hardly had even mosquito bites. It was terrific. And I think that is not always the case. It's seasonally dependent. but now was the end of, not throughout, but generally the end of the dry season. And as a consequence, the number of annoying insects was low.
Thank you.
There was also a question about the cameras that were used, what kind of lenses and things like that.
So I use for this, I actually had two cameras. I had a Canon DSLR with a 300 and a 1.4 extender. And I actually used that less than my bridge camera, which is a Sony RX10 IV. It's lighter to carry, and it has a lens that goes from 24 to 600. The image quality is perhaps not quite as good as with a DSLR, but has good autofocus and a high burst speed. And so most of the pictures were actually taken with that. But again, for this trip, seeing the birds was the primary objective, and sort of photographing them was secondary. So I think we're just lucky to have gotten a few decent pictures.
There is a question about how you found your guide.
Right. So tropical birding is one of the better known bird tour companies, together with Wings and Field Guides and Victor Manual and Rock Jumper and so forth. And so Forrest contacted them and just expressed an interest to set up a private tour, and they assigned us a guide. Actually, the guide they assigned us was a different person, Sam Woods, who some may have met in Ohio at McGee Marsh, where they attend regularly. He actually had a heart attack a couple of days before the tour, and so they set up Jose to go with us instead. But by and large, the guides I had on these trips, guided by professional companies, are terrific, very, very good.
We also had a question about the name of the hummingbird that's in the picture right now.
It's a glittering throated emerald. Thank you. I'm sorry for neglecting to put that on.
Oh, that's okay.
Hi, Magnus. Neil Bjorklund here.
Hey, Neil.
Hey, great to see. I didn't get to see the whole thing, but I got to see a lot of your photos, and you got some nice butterfly shots as well.
Oh, thank you.
How did it go with the butterflies? Did you see a lot?
That's also a terrific question, Neil. And I must say I was a little bit disappointed by not seeing more butterflies than we did. Now we didn't look specifically for butterflies, of course, but certainly we kept our eyes out, and perhaps that was also that it was also caused in part by the fact that this was the dry season, and
right.
So the number of food plants might have been reduced for that reason. But I had expected to see more, for sure.
Yeah, and what percentage of the time were you in higher elevations versus, the end where you went lower?
So we were at higher elevation, probably 60% of the time.
Well, yeah, that's going to affect the butterfly diversity for sure.
For sure.
Together with the dry season.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm envious of some of the photos you got. They were species that I missed. Many of them were ones I missed. So well done.
Well, thank you. We'll have to compare notes on that.
I would love to.
Yeah, that photograph of the Hillstar was phenomenal. Blue-throated Hillstar, just an amazing photograph. Wow. Well, maybe that's about all the questions we have. A great program, a lot of comments about that, and wonderful photographs and great narration. So we got a lot of really good comments coming in. Really appreciate all you did to put this program together. Did a really nice job.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate that. And thanks again for having me.
Yeah, it was wonderful presentation. Thanks, Magnus. And it's great to be able to have you share it with us. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Okay, and then remember, next month, it's going to be the 26th of April. We'll be at 100 Willamette at the University of Oregon with Bruce Newhouse. And we'll also be doing it Zoom. So you'll have an option to come and see us or participate from home. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Magnus. Excellent program. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks, Magnus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi to Rosie, by the way.
Will do.
Yes.
Yeah, we wanted more pictures of Rosie.
That was vetoed.
Understand.
By the way, there were 84 computers on here tonight, which is a really nice number of folks tuning in.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that usually means more than that because there's usually more than one person at each computer.
Mhm, mhm.
Okay, I'm going to sign off. Take
Thanks
care.
so much. That was great. Thank you so much.
Good
Yeah,
night,
and good night,
everyone.
Debbie. Get a nice night's sleep.
Good night, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.